In my last Fractal video, I was just breaking into Tier 3, and I had a lot to say about my experience. For just about every positive I had, there was also an annoyance with them. I enjoyed the environments of the dungeons themselves, but some encounters weren't really up my alley. The fractal leveling was a cool way to give compounding difficulty to the same levels, but I didn't really enjoy the agony grind. Now, I've reached max fractal level, decked out my main and some alts in full +9 agony resistance, and got the legendary backpack ad infinitum. With that set up, I'm gonna spend this video talking about my experience getting to this point and how, if any of my opinions have changed. Originally, I wanted to make a video about my first piece of Ascended gear, but I really didn't have enough to talk about from just having one piece, especially since it was a ring that I got out of a fractal. Ooh, how exciting, opening a box to get a ring. But I ended up getting a bunch of Ascended gear in no time after that. My main gearing method was fractals, but I spent a lot of time doing other endgame PvE. Strikes mostly, with a little bit of raiding mixed in, but that's a topic for another video. And the next thing I knew, I was fully decked out in Ascended gear. My first wall in gear progression was figuring out just how to get Ascended gear. At first, I thought it mostly just dropped randomly in fractals, but then I found out every Ascended stat prefix has a crafted version. So I set out on a crafting journey. However, to make the specific piece of gear I wanted, I needed its Ascended stat inscription, and those are mostly rewarded from open world events from their respective expansion zones. Yeah, that was too much side work. Thankfully, I quickly found out about Grandmaster marks. Basically, my route to getting stat selectable Ascended armor and weapons. They're tokens that are crafted with high-level refined materials. You take 3 of the same mark to this fractal vendor to purchase a piece of Ascended gear related to the crafting discipline. The biggest caveat to Grandmaster marks is their components require time-gated materials to make, specifically a once-a-day timer, and I needed 3 Grandmaster marks per piece of Ascended equipment. With only grinding instance PvE, I can make about 1 to 2, if I'm lucky, marks a day, but the vendor also requires fractal currency and gold in addition to the Grandmaster marks to purchase anything, which I was severely lacking in. So I went in a loop of doing daily crafts when I had the materials and running fractal dailies until I could eventually purchase some Ascended gear. In the beginning, the grind was tedious, and the overall gold and material gain wasn't worth it. The loot boxes, not those kind, gained at the end of each dungeon require specific keys to open them. A few of them are gotten from dailies, but to open them all at the end of a lot of my early game runs, I needed to buy extra keys from a vendor. I was still making gold from doing this, but I wasn't making a whole lot due to how few bags I was getting or how much I'd be spending on keys. It took me to getting to tier 4 to start making any sort of significant profit, but thankfully the crafting material gain was decent throughout. Then I found another sidetrack. Legendaries are the pinnacle of gear in Guild Wars 2. While they're no different stat-wise from Ascended gear, they have the added benefit of being able to freely change its stats, change its appearance without using transmutation charges, and most important, you can equip them on any character given the profession can equip it at any time with no restrictions. It doesn't take up an inventory slot, and they don't need to be unequipped by other characters. I'd known about legendaries, but it wasn't until I broke into tier 2 that I found out there's a legendary backpack obtained through fractals. This was a huge discovery for me, because I couldn't find reliable ways to get Ascended backpacks at the time, and that was a gear slot I still needed for basically all my alts. But I could skip farming for alts backpacks and just get a legendary and be done with it. So by the time I was in tier 3, I had 4 goals. Reach max fractal level, deck my main out in Ascended gear, max out my agony resistance, and get the legendary backpack ad infinitum. I eventually got enough Grandmaster marks to craft my first Ascended weapons, and I was happy for that. It was my first major piece of gear that I crafted. Even though I had a long journey ahead of me, I feel like just going through this process once was enough to set my expectations and prepare me for future gear crafting. I still needed more Ascended gear, sure, and I ended up getting a full set from a mix of a bunch of different activities. I crafted my way through some of my gear, mostly the weapons, but a lot of my armor was through those sweet armor boxes. not gonna lie, that feeling of getting an Ascended armor box, especially for a slot I didn't have, was so good. Max dopamine instantly. I didn't even realize until I looked at my footage, but I got most of my Ascended gear and the first part of the Ad Infinitum collection finished before I maxed out my Fractal level. The Fractal leveling was probably the easiest part of this journey to do, but man, it felt like it took forever. I just wanted to spend a few sessions just running through Fractals to max out my level, but my LFGs would never fill up for that, so I had to just settle for dailies. I queued at my tier, and sometimes one above if I had enough agony resistance, so I was able to reliably find a group for between 2 to 6 Fractals daily, with maybe 1 to 2 of them giving me a Fractal level. This shit was agonizing, because of how slow it felt to level. The runs where I was getting basically hard carried because I didn't have enough agony resistance to survive mechanics made that experience worse. There were times that I was agony gapped in the same tier that I was in, but I still had to keep going with the daily because it was the only one that would give me Fractal level progress. In those runs, a single thought was ringing in the back of my head. If only my Fractal leveling LFG filled. Of course, this is less of a game issue and more of a player-based issue, but I can't even really blame the players for not wanting to run anything besides the dailies. There's not really a reason to run other Fractals besides them if you're the average player, as the normal Fractal rewards aren't as good compared to like almost any other endgame activity. Thankfully, most of my time was spent running Fractals appropriate for my agony resistance, and those rough patches were few and far between. The grind to max Fractal level was slow, and honestly not that noteworthy, just time consuming. Thinking back on it, those daily gates definitely helped me rack up those +1 agony infusions to craft those +9s. In my last video, I talked about +9 agony infusions costing a lot versus what you get from daily rewards. And yeah, that was just low Fractal level rewards. The beginning feels like ass, sure, but it's kind of irrelevant because the agony doesn't start to get bad until about tier 3. By then, I'd already saved up enough +1 infusions to get a few +9s for my trinkets and armor, which is more important to put infusions on first, by the way. I didn't even mention there were +5s and 7s that you could craft for cheaper as well, but to be fair, they're not as worth it to craft since they're harder to upgrade in the future, but that's min-maxing shit. The agony grind is something that just becomes easier with time. In addition, there isn't that big of a pressure on getting a lot of infusions kitted until late tier 3. Putting like 1 or 2 +9s on my gear was enough to progress me through Fractal levels until I got to the next agony wall. I was just too focused on getting every slot filled to realize this. I do wish there was an easier way to play alts and Fractals, but it's also one of those things where my main was maxed out in agony and I just quickly built up an excess of +1s. Not to mention, the longer I played, the more time I spent at max level versus leveling. Comparatively speaking, it's easier for me to stat out an alt and infusions now versus when I started, and that's probably how it was supposed to be. One of the things I mentioned in part 1 was the bosses feeling hit or miss, especially with their aggro mechanics. I felt like the bosses just randomly targeted players, and it turns out I was right. Sort of. Every enemy has some sort of aggro system, but some enemies have more specific mechanics beyond who deals the most damage, like being the closest or farthest away from the group, picking up specific items, or being randomly chosen, etc. And to know how a mob aggroes, I just needed to guess or read about the encounter on the wiki. The aggro mechanics in this game is still something that I don't really care for, but I think that's more of a UI issue, as the only way to tell if you're being targeted for the most part is by seeing if the enemy is facing you. My main MMO before I got super into Guild Wars 2 was Final Fantasy XIV, and in that game, I get a full list of the enemies that I'm in combat with, as well as the indicators for each mob to let me know if I have aggro. Guild Wars 2 doesn't have this, and while I still don't particularly like what's here, it ultimately doesn't matter. The game is designed around not adhering to the typical Holy Trinity, and most importantly, there are no tanks. Every class has some sort of self-sustain, so if an enemy is targeting me, it's not that big of a deal, because I could just use my heal skill or walk closer to the healer and all my problems are solved. I honestly think I was just getting gear checked in my first impressions video, because the same dungeons that I mentioned I didn't care for, Snowblind, Chaos, and Mytrin, turned out to be incredibly easy when I had the proper agony resistance for it. Snowblind is just avoid the AoEs, aggro doesn't even matter here. Chaos's final encounter does have a boss where aggro matters, but all of my groups tended to just move together without communication when the boss needed to move, so it wasn't even that bad in the end. The Mytrin fractal does have important aggro mechanics. One person holds Mytrin's attention while another person gets targeted by a special bomb attack. The special bomb leaves behind an AoE that leaves the boss vulnerable to damage. The targets for both mechanics are chosen at random and they rotate, and thankfully the targets for each get an indicator over their heads. My biggest issue with the fight now are really just the mechanic indicators. It's hard to tell who's being targeted by what, especially when people tend to stack close together. Thankfully, there isn't a big rush to sort people out, and even if mistakes are made, it's pretty easy to adjust afterwards, so it's not that big of a deal. I think I may have been a bit too harsh on the bosses. I was talking about the game when I didn't fully understand the core concepts and mechanics, and that's okay. As with anything, I learned more as I continued to do it. Got more claim to the combat, actually learned my class, and my opinions changed. I actually kind of enjoy all the fractals now. Some I enjoy more than others just because they're a bit more mechanically intense than the lot, but they all provide a solid experience throughout. Since I released my first fractal video, ArenaNet changed their content release cadence to include, among many other things, one new fractal dungeon a year. The ones to release so far are Silent Surf and Lonely Tower. Both of these fractals, to summarize, are short paths with little to no ads between that lead to the final boss. While they are cool looking, the dungeons to me felt underwhelming. Silent Surf could have been a cool series of jumping puzzles, but the grappling gun that you're given feels so clunky and slow to use. The grappling hook has a delay to it, which isn't an issue most of the times, but there's occasions where I was falling too fast and wasn't able to platform by the time the skill actually went off. The blast charge is fine, just not particularly noteworthy, but the parachute feels so slow. I wish we would have just had gliders here. I understand why that isn't the case though. Fractals are a core game activity, so there's a chance that a player doesn't have any of the expansions, meaning no glider access. The parachute has a limited number of charges to it as well, so a glider wasn't loaned to players likely to fortify the puzzle aspect to the path, but it didn't really mean much because I never found myself strapped for charges of any of the special actions in this section. There was always plenty of room for error. Then the mini encounters between just kind of fell flat because they weren't that impressive. They exist just to teach the players mechanics of the final boss, but the fighting areas are really small and the encounters are so short compared to the fucking sponge of a final boss. And that isn't even just me. The fucking wiki says the same thing. To top it off, the boss isn't even that interesting to make up for its massive health bar. There's like one new mechanic introduced from the previous encounters where each player has to take out a phantom only they can see, which would be cool, but it never fails to just bug out and not work. The boss would be a lot cooler if there were more intense mechanics and the boss had less health. I mean, compare this to the absolute banger Sunqua. I can't believe I didn't notice this in my last video. Peak. It's a fractal with a short linear path to the final boss with few ads between. The only enemies you actually have to fight are the mini-bosses that teach the mechanics of the final boss. The final boss, though, it's just so good. She has a plethora of attacks that swap functionality based off of her elemental attunements, and at certain health gates you have mechanic phases that are harder versions of the mini-boss's mechanics. These aren't particularly hard to do, but they still take a bit of coordination and knowledge to do seamlessly. To top it off, this encounter isn't even that long. You go through phases quickly, and the fight's just a lot more interesting than Silent Surf. The newest Fractal, the Lonely Tower, is at least a bit more solid. The path to the final boss is again just a hallway with 2 encounters before the final boss. Now, I don't think that type of fractal design is bad. Again, some of my favorites have that same structure. My biggest issue with this one specifically is how bare bones it is. The first encounter is just defend the person interacting with the object. The second encounter is a duo fight with 2 bosses, Deimos and Cirrus, bosses from the Bastion of the Penitent raid and Temple of Phoebe strike respectively. The fight here is roughly the same as their individual counterparts, minus a couple mechanics and toned down for 5 people. The fight isn't that noteworthy either. The only unique mechanic here is the bosses enrage when they're close to each other, but that can just be completely ignored with no issue. After that, it's final boss time. Eparch, the Midnight King, and it's a mid-fight. Most of the attacks he does releases these orbs that the players need to collect. Each orb gives a buff and debuff depending on its color. After a few attacks, the boss does his big suck move that pulls you in and consumes any globules left on the ground. On day 1, this fight was a nightmare. The boss did insane damage, and the buffs that he got from absorbing the globules was kind of cracked. To be fair, the difficulty could have just been credited to bad team comp and not knowing the fight, because I couldn't even clear it the first week. I didn't really start running it until a couple weeks after release when the fight got nerfed. In its release state, the final boss was mid at best with interesting, albeit kind of samey attacks that just did too much damage and had too much health. In its current state, yeah, it's the same minus the damage and HP part. The fight itself is still somewhat challenging, it's just that the boss doesn't have that many attacks, and a grand total of 0 of them are really mechanically interesting. I think if there were some interesting mechanics at certain health percentages to break up the monotony, I'd think higher of the boss. But as is, the fight feels boring watching the boss loop through the same 5 AoEs while it's still at 50% health. There's nothing egregiously wrong with the boss, mind you, it's just that the dungeon feels lackluster for a new release. This, paired with the snooze fest that is Silent Surf, has kind of set a trend for what I should expect for future Fractal releases, but I'm still holding out some hope that we get some bangers in the future. After all, the other instance content that recently came out was pretty good, so I think A-Night still has it in them to deliver something awesome. Because I can't keep a consistent time schedule, A-Net released their newest Fractal, Kinfall, as I was writing this video. I ran it and I want to talk about it for a little bit, as it gives an amendment to what I just said. I like Kinfall. It's definitely less intense than the peak Fractals, but I'm fine with that. Not every Fractal needs to be some intense thing for me to like it. I care more about the overall feel. The path to the final boss is a straight shot path with little packs of enemies sprinkled between, but the traversal felt fluid because there's no bullshit here, you just see red and start throwing hands. I do wish the traversal was a bit trickier though, as it's a bit uninspired to be walking down one path doing next to nothing between trash encounters. But at least it's not annoying like Silent Surf. I think some of the elite enemies in the trash packs were a little bit too tanky, but it wasn't that big of a deal because they weren't actually threatening. The final boss was fun and had some really cool attacks. He didn't have a lot of them, but they came out so often that I was constantly on the move. And the telegraphs for the attacks are on point here. I don't think I ever felt like I got hit by something that I couldn't see. If I did get hit, the mechanics didn't feel that punishing. The damage dealt to players isn't that huge unless you're getting hit by everything, and the biggest punishment you get for getting hit by an attack is a short knockup. The final boss's health did feel a bit bloated, so it kind of overstayed its welcome a bit, but it's not excessively so like Silent Surf or Lonely Tower. Overall, the dungeon was enjoyable, albeit a bit easy, but I'm fine with that. Not everything new to a system like Fractals needs to offer more challenge than the last. This release has restored some of my faith for future Fractals, but I do hope they design something more intricate in the future. Before I get into the rest of my legendary grind, I wanted to cap off the Fractal talk with a few of my most and least favorite Fractals. My all-time favorite is Shattered Observatory. It's basically just a series of 3 bosses where the first 2 introduce you to the mechanics of the final boss, and the final boss here is honestly one of my favorite fights in the entire game. The mechanics are solid. The fight has a very calculated pace with distinct phases to it, but the mechanics that you have to do are frantic, constant, and punishing if you don't do them. I love running this and get excited every time it's in the daily rotation. Second up, it's Sunqua. It's in the fucking name, Peak. I've already talked about why I think this fight's cool, so I don't need to go over it again. The Deepstone Fractal is a really fun one as well. Of all the Fractals, this one feels the most like a proper dungeon. It's probably because of the setting, but even the overall encounters help set that feeling so well. Light puzzles that weave into fight mechanics, floor traps, mini-bosses, the works. It's not that intense of a dungeon. Even at higher difficulties, it doesn't take that long to beat. Despite that, the boss still feels moderately challenging with its mechanics. Take notes, Lonely Tower. Last up on this list is Twilight Oasis. This Fractal is just really cool to me. It's a series of mini-bosses into a final boss, but I love how open this dungeon is. After the first couple encounters, you're given this massive fucking area and are just told to find the rest of the encounters. You're also given a special action for a majority of the Fractal that you can freely use in combat and to explore, and you're gonna need it. The final boss is challenging with cool mechanics, and a ton of them encourage you to use the special action to avoid them. Take notes, Silent Surf. Those are my favorites of all the Fractals. On the flip side of this list though, I only have one that I genuinely don't like. Solid Ocean. Fuck this Fractal. It's not challenging, and it's boring as fuck. It's one path with trash mobs littered throughout that are completely skippable with one boss at the end of it. Jade Maw. A giant Cthulhu thing that's invulnerable to all damage except for throwing charged crystals. And charged crystals are gotten by killing special enemies, picking up the item they drop, and waiting for the boss to hit you with its I kill you beam. Literally just stand there and wait the dungeon. Sure, there's other ads that spawn in every time the pitch drops that damages the boss when killed, but that's all you get. I may be hyperbolizing a little bit, because this dungeon can be completed in about 5 minutes. I mean, I had to fucking do it for ad infinitum, but I still let out an audible groan every time it's in my daily rotation just because of how uninteractable it is. Speaking of ad infinitum though, check out this sick backpack. The ad infinitum grind was fucking insane, consisting of doing quest item collections, crafting, and completing fractal challenges. There's 4 tiers of quests to complete, in order. Most of the objectives were honestly pretty easy. There were a lot that I'd immediately grab when available, but those are mainly just items that could be bought from a vendor in the Fractal Hub. For a lot of them that involved being in specific fractals, I waited until the one I needed was in the daily rotation, then asked the party if we could do the special objective. There were a handful of times where I lucked out and had 2 or more of the dungeons I needed as a daily, and I felt like I took off like a bandit. Everyone was really chill about doing them since the challenges really weren't that hard. For the most part, it was complete the fractal with a healing reduction, which was easily ignored. My biggest hurdle in regards to the collection objectives was waiting for them to be a daily. A couple of them had me getting an item from a fractal dungeon and taking it to another world boss or event, or vice versa. Again, they weren't hard to do, but they were the most interesting to me because it got me involved in more than just fractals. It made the journey to getting the backpack feel more like a globe-trotting adventure to obtain. My favorite objective was the 4th tier collection where you needed to take the Arc Diviner's mallet from the cliffside fractal and take it to a secret area in one of the early zones. Getting to the secret spot required me to actually explore the area around it to unlock, which is something that I don't do enough. It made me enjoy the world these devs crafted a lot more and made me appreciate the little details put in. At the end of each quest, I had to craft an ascendant back piece to progress to the next tier, with increasing material requirements for each one. For the crafting, I was a stubborn bastard who refused to use the trading post for a majority of it. Crafting the first backpack finite result honestly wasn't that bad. I run a ton of content outside of Fractals, so I already had a ton of material stocked up. I was naively excited after crafting finite result because I thought the material cost for the next backpacks would be similar. But damn, was I wrong. The tier 2 and 3 backpacks, upper bound and unbound, were definitely harder to craft than their previous tiers. However, I didn't have to do any big material grinds for them, so I progressed through those quickly. After crafting Unbound, I had one last collection tier to finish. Again, a lot of them were just do challenge modes or buying something from a vendor, but there were two objectives that required a gift of metal and a gift of wood. For the uninformed, that's 250 refined tier 6, 5, 4, and 4 ingots or planks depending on the gift, which translates to a lot of materials. These were two frankly huge material sinks that served as the final roadblocks in my collection quest. It took a while, but with time I made them and delivered them to different fractals to finish the 4th tier quest. Then came the real grind. See, completing the final collection quest doesn't get you ad infinitum. No, that's too easy. It just gives you an item that's needed to craft ad infinitum. Along with that, I needed a gift of ascension, Unbound, which was already crafted, and a gift of fortune. An item made from a gift of might, a gift of magic, 250 globs of ectoplasm, and 77 mystic clovers, which, in layman's terms, translates to a lot of fucking materials. By the time I finished the collection quest, I did not have enough material to craft this, but I did have a lot of lower rank material that I could upgrade into what I needed. But that still only got me maybe a quarter of the way to getting that gift of fortune. The rest, I had to grind for. So off I went, farming as much content as I could. Fractals, strikes, raids, meta events. I eventually got desperate enough to start farming open world mobs for materials. Now, during this grind, ANET dropped their, at the time, newest expansion, Secrets of the Obscure. With that came an update to their daily login reward system. Well, update is a complete understatement, they completely changed it. Instead of directly getting items from logging in, tasks needed to be completed to earn this currency called Astral Acclaim, which is used to buy items from the Wizard's Vault. One of the big, if not the biggest ticket item in the Wizard's Vault is the Legendary Weapon Starter Kit. In it contains the precursor weapon of the select legendary weapon, the gift of the legendary weapon, and either a gift of might or magic. For a legendary weapon alone, this is a huge fucking material skip, bypassing a lot of crafting steps to make a legendary weapon. But for me, this was an easy shortcut to getting my gift of fortune. When Soto dropped, I shifted a lot of my farming efforts to earning Astral Acclaim. Luckily, the objectives that I needed to complete were really easy to do. Oh look, evade 3 attacks, perform combo finishers, complete a meta event. Such a challenge. After a couple days, I had enough Astral Acclaim to get the Legendary Starter Kit. To the people that are active Guild Wars 2 players, you know that now, when you get a Legendary Starter Kit, you get to choose between your gift of might or magic. But when Wizard Vault dropped, the gift you got from the starter kit was random. This is important, because when I got this starter kit, I had a lot more materials for a gift of might over the gift of magic, so I was praying the starter kit gave me a gift of magic when I opened it. Cha-ching! As a side note, this was the only ever gift of magic I got from a starter kit before they made it a choice. With a gift of magic in hand, I just needed one more gift, and I had my legendary. By this time, I was too impatient to farm for the rest of the materials, and I figured whatever gold the rest cost would be made up for by the sheer utility of a legendary. So, I went to the trading post, spent 93 gold, got all my materials from the bank, then went off to the Mystic Forge. One gift of fortune later, the only thing I needed to do was place 4 items in the Mystic Forge. I was so excited for this. I'd been waiting for this moment for so long.
Sweet, sweet loot.
It took me a while to get this item, 10 months to be exact, but it was worth it. I've got a piece of gear that can be freely stat changed, equipped on any character, and changed appearance for free. This is it. This is peak gear. There is no need for me to farm for other backpacks anymore because I have the Giga backpack. But this one looks cool. So that's been my Fractal experience. My first video was me expressing some growing pains that I had with them, but looking at it now, it was just because the early rewards weren't that great compared to doing a full tier 4 plus recommended run. The issues that I had with bosses were more just me not fully adapting to the game's combat model, but once I did, I got a lot more enjoyment out of the fights I had issue with. There was a couple of things that I didn't cover, like challenge modes, but I'm not super familiar with them, and I don't really think they had a big impact on my experience and perceptions of the game mode. I got my first legendary, and it kind of started my drive to fully deck out my legendary armory, from armor to weapons to trinkets, but I'm still a ways away from that. I've gotten a couple pieces of equipment that I want to talk about more in another video, but until then, stay safe.